Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to The History of Horror Cinema, a personal podcast journey through the good, bad, and ugly of the history of horror movies, based on my blog, The History of Horror Cinema. Night of Terror, 1933. In the 1930s, it wasn't just the Poverty Row studios that gave us B-picture horror clunkers. Columbia released this fugazi of a gem, otherwise known as He Lived to Kill, starring Bela Lugosi and directed by Ben Stoloff before they achieved major status. It's amusingly bad, with a plot resolution straight out of the Scooby-Doo playbook, but rattles along at a good pace as long as you don't step on the evident cracks. Night of Terror hinges rustily on the combined tropes of Madman on the Loose with a Cat and the Canary-style war of attrition, as relatives feuding over a will are bumped off one by one, and mixes them with the binding agent of a very little science for good measure. The film begins with that peculiarly pointless device of showing us clips of each principal cast member in turn, yet titling them with their character name instead of their stage name. To what purpose? In a sense, the mystery has already begun. A maniac serial killer is at large in America, leaving newspaper clippings pinned to his victims' bodies. For some reason, he focuses his spree on the Reinhardt mansion, where wealthy head of the family Richard Reinhardt, Tully Marshall, watches over his nephew Dr. Arthur Hornsby, George Meeker, as he perfects a laboratory potion that will enable a human to live for extended periods of time without oxygen. He will later prove this by allowing himself to be buried alive. Marshall already had form in this horror subgenre, having played the lawyer in 1927's The Cat and the Canary. Meeker was also well established at playing gloomy, unlucky-in-love wimps. Here he demonstrates this by being so wrapped up in his test tubes that he isn't aware his fiancée Mary, Sally Blaine, is none too convincingly fending off the attentions of wise guy newshound Tom Hartley, played by Wallace Ford. She protests too much that she is not interested in the crude scoop hunter, while he reveals they've just been to the movies together. Later on, she doesn't exactly tear herself away from him when he grabs her for an impulsive snog either. Ford's real-life adventures were worthy of a feature himself. Born Samuel Jones Grundy, or Grundy Jones, he was placed into a Dr. Barnardo's orphanage in Bolton, Lancashire, at the age of 3. 4 years later, he was packed off to Canada as part of a government drive to populate empire farming families in the territory with homegrown adoptees. Sadly, he was one of the 100,000-plus kids unlucky enough to be subjected to conditions of Dickensian cruelty. After a horrendous period of fleeing and forced resettlement totaling 17 times, he escaped the cycle to find a better home and an introduction to showbiz on the road with the vaudeville troupe the Winnipeg Kiddies. At the age of 16, Samuel and a pal hitched their way aboard trains to make their fortune in America. Their grand plans were marred by tragedy, however, when his friend was killed by a train, prompting Samuel to take his name of Wallace Ford, partly as a tribute and also to erase his awful past. Shades of Don Draper in TV's later fictional Mad Men. Aside from his good-hearted Frozzo in Freaks, 1932, Ford went on to a long career, including 2 more of Universal's reactivated franchise sequels, The Mummy's Hand and The Mummy's Tomb. He also enjoyed the happy ending of a reunion with his long-lost mother in England, after a lifetime of believing he was an orphan. Back in the lab, the mood emanating from Arthur is less rosy. It's oddly fitting that he's preparing to be interred, since Meeker seems to recite his lines as a dreary, monotonous eulogy. Surely he should be excited on the verge of a new scientific breakthrough. With Lionel Atwill unavailable for a mad showboating aria, we must look elsewhere for energy in this house. Fortunately for those who like their dialogue delivered with impact, enter Bela Lugosi, the master of delivering portentous force. He is Degar the butler, although you be forgiven for guessing him as an Indian Swami guest, or Sultan, as the detective later labels him, with his tunic, turban, and exotic hooped earring. Lugosi was mired in such personal debt when he made Night of Terror that to make extra money he pulled double duty on this at night, whilst filming as General Petronovich in the W.C. Fields comedy International House by day. This movie certainly does him no artistic favours. He simply veers between the modes of either oppressive hypnotic stare or a pained grimace of wholly understandable private mournfulness. Degas is something of a double act partnered with Seeker, Mary Frey, the darkly Latin American maid who is given to Cassandra-like premonitions of doom. Death is very close. Together they pronounce continual warnings to the family in no uncertain terms. Degas dismisses newspaper contents as nothing but murder, amongst other creepy pearls of glowering wisdom. Homicide is indeed very close. Richard Reinhardt is murdered off-screen, emitting the discomforting groan of someone passing a troublesome stool more than passing away. We then begin to assemble the suspects in the drawing room, as it were. Firstly, there is the elusive, grotesquely ugly maniac himself, snaggle-toothed and broad-brimmed of hat. We can rule out Tom and Mary as they have the alibi of a chauffeur-driven return to the house whilst a lovers-lane couple were being murdered. Equally, we can cancel out the chauffeur himself, Martin, Oscar Smith, a feat the actor may wish to have had extended to the entire film in a sense, as despite a sizable part, he is clearly only there to inherit the laudable dumb black stereotype mantle from Willie Best in 1932's The Monster Walks. Smith is required to play the wide-eyed coward and with a speech pattern straight off the southern plantation. Ironically, in spite of such relegation, he displays the most common sense of any of the characters. Upon discovering that in Reinhardt's will each surviving heir inherits the shares of the others, he'd rather be disinherited from his $100 a week inheritance that is paid as long as I live. It's not only Martin that is the victim of racism. The enigmatic Degas and Seeker are twice referred to as heathens, for the presumed impertinence of being foreign. Could they be guilty, especially as Lugosi pauses to ponder the possibilities in the will for their own benefit? Our suspicions are meant to fall on the vulture pair of relatives who've suddenly arrived to claim their shares. John and Sarah Reinhardt, Bryant Washburn and Gertrude Michael resent the equal parity given to the servants in the will. This now becomes a fun zero-sum game, as one by one the bodies pile up, meaning Tom is repeatedly on the phone calling his updated copy through to the newspaper's night desk every time. As the cast are bumped off, more human firewood turns up for the bonfire. The cops arrive, led by Matt McHugh, one of those Hollywood detectives who are amusingly interchangeable with unsavory mobsters. It takes one to catch one. Also now on hand are a couple of professional beards from the committee to witness Arthur's scientific experiment. Yes, finally, he's ready to prove his amazing life serum's properties by having himself buried and rejuvenated by it, with all the enthusiasm of a man reading out a Nigerian spam email. Arthur entrusts Degas with the only key to the drug cabinet, impressing on him that they wait 8 hours till 5 a.m. before administering it. This begs the question, how will they give him the serum in his grave without letting in oxygen that negates the whole point of the experiment? Well, it's all mind over matter, really, and once you apply a mind to this script, it ceases to matter. John Reinhardt is not waiting around. He appears to incriminate himself by pilfering the key from the dozing Degas, but is fatally stabbed by a shadowy, knife-wielding figure. Martin once more shows the smart instinct for self-preservation everyone else lacks. I don't care where you put me, as long as you put me next to a door. I know the feeling. The plot of Night of Terror shrinks like a slug under the salt of close examination, but you have to admit it never stops moving. The occupants decide to hold a séance led by Seeker, much to the objections of Degas. Sadly, she checks out with a scream whilst trying to contact her old master on the astral plane. The group opts to revive Arthur early. Listen out for the esteemed professor who tells the detective that the serum cabinet is in the lavatory. The pace now moves into high gear. Degas is forced to open the cabinet, yet sneakily stalls for time by drugging the supervising cop with an oriental cigarette. High gear of a different sort. Lo and behold, we discover a secret tunnel from the grave used by Arthur, the real criminal,
who employed the maniac, apparently shot dead and never explained as a character, in his dastardly plan to liquidate all his rivals to the Reinhardt fortune. His uncle Richard was also dispatched because he allegedly had rumbled that Arthur's wonder drug was bogus. It's a refreshing change to see Lugosi in something of a rare heroic vein, holding the culprit who would have got away with it if not for those meddling, kids. Speaking of rare, at the time I wrote this review, Night of Terror was extremely hard to find. I was lucky to trace a private owner's copy, which unfortunately cuts just before Edwin Maxwell as the maniac actually rises from his dead place to threaten the audience with dire consequences. If you dare tell anyone how this picture ends. He needn't go to all that trouble. Anyone who recommends this to a friend at all will regret it, unless it's for a so bad it's good laugh.